almost every part of you is designed to be able to fit in somewhere. And it was always a different environment. It was always a different social world. It was always a different natural world that we had to fit into.
I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with the people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more.
So today, I'm going to talk about my own research in an area which is quite controversial in the evolutionary sciences, and I'm going to kind of controversially name this evolutionary storytelling. And the reason that's controversial is because there's a long time critique of evolutionary theory, which actually goes back to Darwin's original publication of Origin of the Species. His teacher, Adam Sedgwick, who was a geologist who taught Darwin geology, actually here in Cambridge, where I am now, read Darwin's original manuscript and was horrified that Darwin had left behind what he saw as the true scientific method that he'd been taught. And this is a criticism which has rung out since Darwin's time and continues today, which is that all we're doing in the evolutionary science is broadly defined, but particularly in evolutionary psychology, you'll hear this criticism. All we're doing is storytelling. We're just conjuring up pretty stories about the past. We're speculating about a historical process, which is unobservable. And the strength to this criticism, and the reason why it does hold to some extent, is that the evolutionary process has happened. It's done. What we're trying to do is explain the traits we see around us today, referencing the thousands, millions of years behind us. And as much as you can play out evolutionary experiments in labs and, force flies to develop different types of wings by putting them under artificial selection, and we are quite sure from all the genetic evidence and evidence from demography and from around the world and the way that species seem related if they're closer together, and et cetera, we can clearly see that evolution happened, that the natural selection is the process which shapes biology. But it's still ultimately a historical process. So the story that we want to tell about how humans became able to feel, sadness and happiness and love and jealousy, these are the stories which we might want to think about in evolutionary psychology and psychiatry. They are hidden behind the veil of the past, and until we get a time machine, we will never be able to observe really what happened. And so this is the major criticism which has been raised against the evolutionary sciences in general, but also especially against evolutionary psychology and also against evolutionary psychiatry. So this is often called the just so storytelling critique, which is named after Rudyard Kipling's book of tales for children, explaining how animals got their characteristics in all sorts of fanciful ways. For instance, the elephant got its trunk because it used to have a normal nose, but then it went down to see what the alligator ate for lunch. And the alligator bit its nose and pulled it and pulled it and pulled it, and it pulled it out into the trunk. And that's how the elephant got its trunk. And the just so storytelling critique is basically arguing that what we're trying to talk about and the stories we tell in evolutionary psychology and psychiatry are little more than these just so stories, where we're observing some feature of the mind today and we are making up a story which sort of fits, but that actually has no substantial scientific merit. So this is a classic criticism which has been leveled, as I say, for centuries. So this criticism is sort of the main, it's bound to cause frustration amongst evolutionary psychologists and scientists in general. And it's very annoying because, yes, absolutely, what we are trying to do is talk about the historical process. And yes, we can't look into the past, so we will never really know what happened. But clearly evolution did happen. We can see evolution happening everywhere around us in the natural world. There's no other good reason why we would have all of these features of our psychology. So there's kind of a real disconnect between the sort of critics who, if they're kind of taking a very strong stance, will say, well, we just can't say anything about history at all, so we should just leave this and consider it basically beyond science. And the many of us who really want to understand what happened for that time, for the hundreds of thousands of years which shaped us, because we think it's important. This isn't just some random scientific theory about rock formation or whatever. No offense to the geologists, but we're really trying to explain why humans are the way they are, why we're suffering, and just pushing it aside and saying, oh, well, evolution happened and it definitely shaped the mind. Every critic will admit that, our mind is somehow shaped by evolution. No one can look at lust and hunger and jealousy and affection and think that these are just kind of random occurrences. They obviously relate to our evolutionary history. Even the most kind of ardent skeptics will accept that that's kind of an important part of the explanation. But then the question is, how far can you go with that? And the evolutionary psychologists and psychiatrists believe that we should be trying to take that next step. And even though the past is invisible, we should be trying to work out, to the best of our ability, why from this evolutionary perspective do we have the traits and the disorders that we observe today. So the criticism is that it's all just storytelling. The response varies, but part of what my research has looked at is how to best basically defend against this criticism and respond to it. Because it is fair to some extent. We have to recognize that these stories are complex and hidden in history. So one of the things that I've done over the last few years, several years actually, is think about better methods for making these inferences. We're just trying to infer what happened in the past. So how can we do that? Well, I think it's useful to kind of ground ourselves in recognizing the complexity of the actual story. So to kind of rewind to the most basic fundamental principle of evolution by natural selection, basically what Darwin proposed was that if there are differences between individuals and those differences are heritable, so they're passed on from generation to generation, and they cause differences in reproductive success. So if an individual with good eyesight has more children than a person with bad eyesight, and that causes them to have more children, and that gets passed on to those children, then you will see, and there's mutation, and variation, then you will see selection for better eyesight over time. This is kind of fundamental evolutionary theory. Everything kind of has to come downstream of that. The interesting question at a sort of higher level and kind of from a more, perhaps a philosophical stance, is asking what kind of scientific hypothesis you want to make about these traits. So really the story of our eyes, for instance, evolving and being selected for, is the story of hundreds of thousands of individuals behind us, every single one of our ancestors who had anything like eyes, which were slowly changing over time. And every single one of them had to survive and reproduce. That's the story of why my eyes are the way they are. And this is the most simple adaptation, and we know that, eyes are for seeing. It's the textbook function of an adaptation. But then it becomes complex because actually the way that each ancestor's eyes was seeing and was helping them really could differ between, generations and thousands of years and hundreds of thousands of years. We were living in different environments. We had different predators and different prey. And at some points in time, we were eating more fruit. And then we were, being agriculturalists and having to check for insects and whatever, all of the massively complex life, which had to be played out by every single one of mine and your ancestors. That's the story. That's the full evolutionary story of why our eyes are the way they are. Because whenever there were eyes that were slightly better at the important tasks, whether it was finding ripe fruit in a forest, for instance, then that story of that particular individual using those eyes and succeeding because of them, that's really the story that is the evolutionary story, which explains why we can see in the way that we do. It explains why we have such good color vision, because we went through this period of needing to seek out fruit, for instance. It explains why we're good at kind of noticing little rustles and snake-shaped objects, because we at points, there were times, and for many years, it was important for our ancestors to be able to react to those things. But obviously, this snake response was not actually important for all of them. A lot of them didn't come across snakes, but at some points it was. So this is where some of the complexity creeps in. Like the actual story, which was played out in each individual, was complex in itself. And then what you're trying to do is basically come up with this nice kind of broad explanation which can be applied across many of those individuals over a long period of time. So you can see why this is going to be, you're sort of limited in your precision here, simply by the nature of the process we're trying to explain. We're trying to explain this giant history of thousands of individuals living in very complex environments. And with eyes, we can make some sort of tautological statement like, well, eyes were for seeing, when all we do is, eyes are defined as the organs which see, so it's sort of yeah, sure, eyes are for seeing, but why? What was important about seeing? What was it about the particular types of seeing and the challenges of seeing that made our eyes develop in the way that they have? And when you get into psychological traits and traits which can be related to disorder, it becomes even more complex, because eyes are for seeing is a very simple sort of tautological statement. But when you want to talk about psychological traits that are reacting to complicated social environments, for instance, like feeling ashamed when you do something which people look down upon, this shame response, which is very common and seems to be sort of universal, and is sort of predictably arises in times when you break some norm or you act in some way which you shouldn't really be doing, and so you feel this negative emotion to plausibly make you realize that you shouldn't do it and to rectify your bad actions, and that our ability to shame each other and to feel shame is undoubtedly one of the ways in which we have kind of created a culture and a society who abide by the same rules and follow law, and at some much later stage, of course. So yeah, the story of where each of these emotions and each of these traits came from is going to be much more complicated than the story of eyes. And really what it is the story of thousands of individuals feeling these emotions in various ways and in various contexts, and it's somehow adding up to being more reproductively successful than the people who weren't feeling the shame, for instance. So yeah, this is really complicated. There's one more example which I think is useful to pick up on, which is of lactase tolerance. So if you're living in the Northern Europe, or if you have Northern European ancestry, or broader European ancestry, but particularly Northern European, then you can probably digest milk into adulthood. All mammals can digest milk as infants, and then they end up, the lactose, which is digested by the lactase enzyme, the lactase enzyme ends up deactivating at some point, because for most mammals, they don't need to drink milk past the juvenile stage. However, some humans had herds of goats or cattle, mostly sheep sometimes, and some humans in some areas kept these animals, were pastoralists, lived off them, and drank their milk, and as a consequence have had recent selection for the lactase enzyme to persist into adulthood. So the important thing about this is it's like very obviously the groups who have grown up around sheep and goats and cattle who can digest lactase, and we can actually see in the genome that there's been strong selection for this ability. Basically, the gene which turned off lactase previously is just kind of prevented from working, and so we just kind of consistently produce lactase. So great, we can digest milk. And this is, a classic common example of the recent adaptation in humans to a very obvious environmental pressure, which is kind of unique to these groups which have the opportunity to drink milk into adulthood. Now, we can say that lactase is there to digest milk, fine, but then if you were actually to dig into the story, like the story that we're looking for is not just that, it's just, it's to digest milk. We want to know why. Why is it good to digest milk? And actually, once we start thinking about this, it becomes much more complicated, because there's been various hypotheses, and actually a recent paper helped to decide between them. But you can think of all sorts of reasons why digesting milk in adulthood is good. Maybe it's because it's just extra calories. Maybe it's because it's useful for the water content in milk, and you don't get lactase intolerance if you drink it and you can digest the lactase. Maybe it was particularly useful for mothers who had a high calorific demand when they were breastfeeding. Maybe it was useful for the protein content as well, which would then allow people to grow stronger and taller. And then you can keep on asking questions like, well, why was it good to be able to be stronger? Well, maybe it was more useful to be able to farm as well, or to make tools, or to win in status competitions, or whatever. I mean, every kind of evolutionary story has all of these different levels of analysis, and all of these sort of extrapolated complexities, which are the full story as to why the reproductive success happened. The going from mutation, which makes you be able to digest milk in adulthood, to reproductive success and all of your children kind of out-competing or out-reproducing the other people in your group, that's a complicated story, which actually really needs the stories of every single person who was benefiting from that mutation. So what we're kind of looking for is a nice summary of what it was that lactase did. And so there was this recent paper which looked into this and tried to find, or seemed to show, that the selection on lactase was actually not slow and steady, as you might expect. It's not like every generation or every 100 years there was a slow increase in the amount of individuals who had the lactase enzyme. This was using data from graves, basically, like thousands of individuals had been dug up from different times and had been genotyped to find out how many of them, what proportion of them had the lactase enzyme. And basically what they found was that it wasn't like there was this slow increase over time. Actually, what happened was in times of massive population decline, so maybe famine, maybe disease, then the people who seemed to survive more were the ones who could produce lactase. So it's not like having the lactase around or having the milk around that you can drink was kind of always a little bit good. It seems like most of what happened was there were periods of extreme starvation or illness, and in those times, the only people who survived were the ones who kind of already were able to drink the milk. So this is interesting. It kind of gives us some insight into what this story is, to explain why, most of us who come from these pastoralist populations have this lactase enzyme. Okay, but the stories are complicated, even for these very simple things. I think that the thing that we need to recognize is this process did happen, but it's really complicated, and we really shouldn't expect to be able to give a really comprehensive, exact story of what every single one of those individuals did to survive and reproduce more effectively due to lactase or depression or autism or ADHD. So that's the interesting and then an important back point. We have to be a little bit humble about recognizing that the science that we're trying to do is supposed to be revealing something about that story, but the story itself is ridiculously complex, and we can't expect to cover all of it. So that's kind of fine. If we're happy with that, we can then proceed and say, okay, well, what kind of evidence should we be collecting to try and work out, what these stories are? What kind of broad story can I give for lactase persistence or, all of these emotions? One important thing to note here, and this is something that I've kind of looked at in my research, is that it's easier to say with fair amounts of certainty that something is an adaptation and it has some story than it is to talk about the story itself. So it's much easier to look at lactase tolerance and say, okay, it was obviously beneficial somehow. If an adaptation is just a thing that increases your fitness, that was reproductively successful, then it's very easy to say, okay, lactase tolerance is an adaptation, and then the function of that adaptation can be really complicated and is actually this really complicated story because it's this process which happened over thousands of years. But we can take different pieces of evidence and use them to infer that the trait was an adaptation without having to really know much about the story. So even before we had the evidence that there was this sharp increase in the lactase tolerance in different in these particular time periods, even before that, we could look and we can say, okay, look, lots of people who come from pastoralist populations have this gene. It's almost universal. It arises, early in life, and there was this obvious kind of adaptive benefit as an infant. The fact that it's universal amongst pastoralists later in adulthood implies it must be an adaptation. And we don't really need to know the story to know that. So we can kind of say, yeah, okay, this is a good thing, or this was a good thing, or this had some story. But yes, but without having to go into the details. And the more we can reveal the details, is maybe that's what we want to do. Maybe that, as evolutionary scientists, that's the thing we should be trying to do. Maybe that's what we care about more than just saying, oh, it's an adaptation. That's actually kind of boring. Some of the original theorists in and scientists involved in developing evolutionary theory sort of take adaptation as standard. Like it is almost boring, especially with traits like eyes. Like the fact that eyes are good and were adaptations and are adaptations is, so what? We don't really need a science of telling adaptation in that case. What we really want to know is, eyes are for seeing, and we want to kind of show how good they are at seeing and the different types of seeing which they might have supported for different species, etc. So for some things it doesn't really matter, and you can just say, well, it's an adaptation, but actually we don't care. However, there are important cases, especially in evolutionary psychiatry, where really the big question is not just about the story and giving some kind of nice summary which explains why depression exists, for instance. What we kind of want to know as well is it actually an adaptation? Did it actually help people? Was it somehow beneficial to reproductive success? Is that why we are liable to depression today? And also, to what extent was depression, if we take that example, to what extent was it actually beneficial? Was it only beneficial in small amounts, for brief periods of time and under certain environmental circumstances, but was never actually adaptive if it lasted for 2 years? And even without asking the story of why, without having to kind of get into the complexities of what depressed individuals were doing that made them more reproductively successful than non-depressed individuals, we don't have to really care about the functional story to want to know, or to realize that it's important to know that adaptation itself is the question. Like, are these disorders, all the traits related to them, are they adaptations, and to what extent, and in who and when? And this is actually a simpler question, sort of, because it's less of asking about this complicated story. It's more just asking about, did it have a positive effect? And there's different types of evidence you can use. You can look, for instance, at genetics and universality to say that, okay, well, it seems very likely that this trait, was positively selected because it's so common, because it's inherited, because it arrives early in life. Because it has these quite predictable reactive trajectories. This doesn't look like sort of randomness or disease or mutation. This looks like what we expect adaptations to do. So you can kind of separate these two sides to the hypothesis. And this is maybe a little technical, and I don't know if anyone cares, but it is important. It's important to realize that, firstly, the functional story can be really complex, and it fundamentally is really complex, but that doesn't really matter, because one of the big things we want to know is, like, is this adaptive at all? That really is the big question hanging over most of these disorders. So yeah, there are ways, and my research, which I won't go into because it is probably too complex, at least in this particular format, to get into the details of how you do this. But the point is, it is possible to do, and to separate out this question of the function versus like whether it is an adaptation or not. So what does this actually mean? What does it mean that these stories are incredibly complex, but we can do an okay job of telling whether or not there's any story at all, and whether it is an adaptation, even if we can do a much worse job, or we're more limited in knowing about the kind of complexities of the story. So, I mean, there's a couple of things here. Scientifically, it's easier to think about if all we care about is broadly working out whether we should class this as a true disorder that has nothing to do with evolution and is just sort of breaking brains, or whether or not and we can separate that from whether we want to talk about functional stories. The question is, socially and at the level of the patient and the public, does it matter that these stories are really, really complex and actually, almost infinitely complex? They're unique, they're individual. Every individual who had something like autism for the last 200,000 years lived a different life. And the way that their different way of thinking affected their life would have been unique. But there are some regularities there, and it's in those kind of regularities that we might want to look for the evolutionary explanation. But we also need to remember that the explanation we're going to find is not going to be one that perfectly fits every person for the last 200,000 years who had something like that trait. That's not realistic, and I mean, we can never test it anyway because it is hidden behind history. But maybe what we want to be doing is looking for a sort of broad summary, a broad story, which best fits the most amount of those individuals. And I guess I won't get into the specifics of any trait or disorder here as to where or what. Well, okay, let's take autism, for example. So Simon Baron-Cohen has proposed that autism is related to a systemizing tendency. And systemizing is this kind of very broad term, which basically means being drawn to sort of the non-human realm of objects and systems and repeatable patterns. And this is quite a nice level of hypothesis because it is very, very broad, and you could maybe look at an individual now who is really excellent at some form of engineering and see that they are systemizing and they have autistic-like traits, or even just autism. They might have a diagnosis, but clearly, and say that their ancestors had similar traits, but 100 years ago, or even the last generation, the ancestor wouldn't have been engineering. They would have been farming. And on the farm, that systemizing mentality played out in its own way. Every individual is a product of their own very unique environment. You're just reacting to whatever's around you. And the fact that we now live in this very strange world where we have jobs and houses and education means that we'll be doing very different things to our ancestors did. And so the story as to where autism or autistic traits fit into a life today is going to be very different to the story that played out for the last 100 years or the 1,000 years before that. But maybe broadly, this systemizing explanation kind of fits. There was always some kind of regularity of system, some sort of obsession with the non-human world, some sort of extra ability in memorizing these repeatable patterns, or noticing details in the environment, and in these kind of specific things that you're obsessed with, that kind of broadly would have helped many individuals for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years even. So this sort of high-level explanation is quite plausible. You can look at the things that autistic people are good at today. You can look at what their relatives are doing. You can sort of see places in human history where that way of thinking would have been useful. And that could maybe be a broad functional story. And the important thing here is that, yes, okay, it's a story, and the true story is the story of every single one of those individuals, their ancestors who had anything like those traits, and the way that that trait added up to them surviving and reproducing, which was often this complicated mess of them being in a social group and them being kind of appreciated for their abilities, but maybe also, their social nuances being sort of overlooked, or their lack of social nuance being overlooked, I should say. So it's going to be a complicated story that really is about all of these individuals, but we can summarize it, and we can accept that, okay, we're just trying to create a story, and that can be quite useful, I think. And we can also look and say, well, okay, we can't be very precise about the story, but we can be pretty clear about whether or not these traits are an adaptation. So whether they were positively selected, whether they had any kind of good impact, whether they were selected for. And for that, we don't really need to talk about the individual stories and exactly how each person with autistic traits managed to achieve reproductive success. What we can just say is, like, look, these traits are common in the population, they're early onset, they have a long duration, often they are common enough to be prevalent and present in every kind of hunter-gatherer sized group. Like every band of roaming individuals would have had one or two people who are sort of on the spectrum. By that I mean like subclinical autism, because these bands are about 20, 30 people. And about 5 to 9% of us could be kind of on the spectrum. And then you can have, full autism, which is maybe present in 1 to 2% of people. And then every larger social group would have had probably one person with those sorts of traits. Now, these are like exactly what those autistic people were doing in every single group is kind of the important point. It's like that question is the story of exactly why we are left with autism. But we'll never be able to know that story precisely. But we can say that, okay, well, it seems like these things had some positive effect because they haven't been selected out. They're extremely visible to selection. They're early onset. We don't have any other good explanation for these traits. If you add up all the evidence and you try and explain it, how else would you explain it except for some sort of positive selection? Some sort of adaptation is basically at play here. So the stories are kind of the important thing, but they're also not that important in making these very basic claim about was this good or not. One of the cool things I think about this recognition of like the kind of complexity of the science and the different types of hypothesis which we can think about is that for you as a person who has autistic traits today, or has any trait, jealousy or anger or ADHD or whatever. So you are living a unique life in the same way that every one of your ancestors lived unique lives. And each of them basically had to make the most of their innate tendencies to survive and reproduce. And they were all successful. All of your ancestors were successful. And they made the best of what they had. And actually they made it better than others who didn't succeed and didn't survive. And yes, each one of their stories is unique, as yours will be. But that uniqueness is sort of the important point. Like, you couldn't have an autistic trait that was like very exactly about memorizing plant types or recognizing leaf shapes, because actually that trait is kind of only so relevant for some environments. Really what you need to do is you need to be adaptable. You need to have these kind of broad tendencies which manifest according to your unique environment, and you need to be kind of drawn to whatever will help you make it in your own life. You're not meant to be exactly like your ancestors. You're meant to have these general tendencies which you find a way to integrate into your own life. So I think that one of the maybe the dangers of evolutionary hypothesizing is that we put forward these stories of, you know, autistics being systemizers or whatever it is. And then people thinking like, oh, but I'm actually not that good at systemizing in this way. And like, am I not doing the thing that I'm evolved to do? And the sort of mistake there is thinking that you're trying, is not realizing that the real challenge is, as an individual, making the most of what you've got. How are you going to make it? And it doesn't have to be following in the footsteps of the story which came before you. You know, when you use your eyes to read computer screens and your fingers to type on keyboards, then what you're doing is using appendages which were adaptive for a completely different reason for hundreds of thousands of years. You know, and the way that you're going to use your body and your brain today to survive and succeed is going to be completely different to what your ancestors did. But you'll still make it, and that's the kind of point. You need to adapt, and you shouldn't expect that what you're experiencing should fall into this kind of cookie cutter evolutionary history. You know, you're not meant to, and none of our ancestors were ever playing out the exact life of any of their predecessors either. So kind of being quite individual about it, and sort of recognizing that it's a challenge that's unique to you, is kind of actually the real evolutionary story, which was just of individuals succeeding with their own traits. And so I think that there's like a real place for sort of soul searching and recognizing your own environment, and not listening to evolutionary psychologists or psychiatrists telling you what you're supposed to be doing. Yes, even if it's useful to recognize that, you know, almost every part of you is designed to be able to fit in somewhere, and it was always a different environment, it was always a different social world, it was always a different natural world that we had to fit into. So yeah, just trying to make the most of it is actually what we are designed to do. Yes, and just trusting that you have the capacities is, I think, an important one of the important messages. So I want to kind of final little point here. Evolutionary hypothesizing is often pushed off as just so storytelling, and it has been for over a century, almost 200 years. Now, that may be true, as I've talked about. You know, these are historical hypotheses. We can never really observe them. Fine. However, I think that there is a lot of storytelling outside of the evolutionary sciences, which is almost more egregious and, frankly, kind of quite ridiculous sometimes, especially in the case of psychiatry and even medicine generally, but yes, particularly psychiatry. I'm going to take an aim at the sort of rampant speculative hypothesizing in psychiatry about some breakage. And so what I'm thinking of here is, okay, so here's an example. I met a researcher who was very sure that schizophrenia is caused by a Toxoplasma gondii infection, caught mostly from cats. Now, okay, it's a hypothesis. Put it forward. Okay, interesting. Why do you think that? Oh, well, you find schizophrenia in communities where there's more deprivation and there's more cats and cleanliness and whatever. But then you kind of dig a little bit deeper, and you realize that the person will just kind of fit their hypothesis to the evidence in the most sort of ridiculous ways. So when I was talking to this researcher, I kind of mentioned, well, why... there's very little direct evidence of this, by the way. There are a couple of studies, I think, that show that schizophrenics are more likely to have toxoplasma, but that probably is something to do with them being in different environments and actually just liking cats more, whatever the hell it is. The causal link is clearly not, has not been established, let's put it that way. But then, so I started asking questions about, okay, well, what does schizophrenia look like that would be explained by toxoplasma? And for instance, schizophrenia often has an onset at between sort of 16 and 25, really. So I asked, well, why do you think that this is the onset? And so he was like, oh, well, maybe you're, by that age, you've been exposed to the toxoplasma. And then I was like, well, why does psychosis kind of come in these episodes? Schizophrenia is often not like a constant experience. It's more, fluctuates between, extreme episodes of psychosis and then sort of more lulled periods. And he said, well, maybe that's the toxoplasma flaring up. And you can kind of run through all of these, and you talk about environments and different stresses and environments, and why does social inequality cause it? Oh, well, it's there's more toxoplasma around. Now the thing is, basically what's happening here is very similar to what the evolutionary scientists are accused of doing, which is sort of making up possible explanations to fit around their pre-existing hypothesis, even though there's no direct evidence. It's not like we've looked at schizophrenics and seen that, oh my God, look, they're in an episode of psychosis and the toxoplasma is going wild right now. That never happened. He was just very willing to just sort of fit in this hypothesis to the evidence as it was presented in a way that is essentially storytelling, in a very unscientific way. And so I think that actually a lot of psychiatry does this. Basically, every chemical imbalance hypothesis or infection or metabolism or microbiome hypothesis has to deal with these sort of objective facts, and very, very, very rarely, in fact, well, never in psychiatry, never in kind of mainstream psychiatry do these explanations kind of really fully explain the variation that we see in all of these traits. But people sort of just jam in their explanation. They're like, oh, well, maybe that's why. Maybe this is the proximate explanation. And I think this is basically exactly the same problem that has been leveled at evolutionary scientists. And I think that although we might, and in fairness, fairly claim that evolutionary scientists are just so storytelling sometimes, I think that these proximate researchers are what I'd call just no storytelling. They're just saying, no, it's some disease. Oh, it's this, the disease just does that. The disease makes autistic people more intelligent in this particular dimension. The disease just happens to cause psychosis to manifest at these age and these periods. And they do so in such a way that is very, very much unscientific, frankly. So yeah, I think just no storytelling is a real problem, perhaps like a major problem in psychiatry and mainstream psychiatry. And thinking about the adaptive explanations behind all of these problems is something which really is sort of better supported by the evidence than these random pathologies, which really can't explain why these things are happening. And the reason why there's a really good reason to look into the evolutionary explanations is because almost all of psychiatry is all of the common mental disorders are extremely paradoxical from an evolutionary perspective. They are early onset. Diseases shouldn't appear early in life. Heritable diseases shouldn't appear early in life. Evolution should be able to remove them. It is bizarre that there is no physical disorder which is like heritable and arises at the age of like 14 to 18 reliably in like a huge percentage of the population. Almost all physical kind of health problems arise past the age of reproduction when you're, in your 40s, 50s, 60s and older, because that is the period where you've already had your kids. So any trait that arises is not visible to selection. So think about whether the trait could be selected on is super important. And because most mental disorders arise in like the teens, which is exactly when like it's the most important period of your life, you should be as mentally healthy as possible. You should be seeing lots of adaptations to fit into your social environment and, find yourself a partner and like gain social status. And, there's all sorts of challenges which arise when you're kind of in early adulthood. We would expect loads of lots of very strong selection on emotions and psychology, which can help you at that exact period in life. We don't see loads of random physical diseases arising. And these are heritable conditions. They should have been selected. Clearly, this is paradoxical. There should be some explanation here. Now, of course, maybe it's adaptations which are going wrong in modern environments and whatever, that we can discuss that. But the idea that there's some adaptive process behind this is, I think, backed up by the fact that these conditions are so early onset. They last for a significant amount of time and do affect your life. We see them in so many people that they would be present in basically every hunter-gatherer group, although we need to go and actually test the hunter-gatherers. But they're common enough that we would assume that they should arise, at least in those people, in some people in those kind of groups, in some form. Who knows whether they arise in exactly the same form. We know, for instance, that eating disorders don't arise in the same form between societies. Or they don't appear in non-Western societies, basically. But the tendency, the trait behind eating disorders probably does, because it seems quite heritable. So the question is, what is that tendency doing if it's not attaching to some body image and trying to attain that? Maybe it's doing something else which is actually useful, but then becomes harmful when it gets exposed to these modern norms. Anyway, I'm not going to go off on that right now, but I do think that this problem of just no storytelling is real, and it's bigger than just so storytelling. I mean, it's definitely wasting more money than just so storytelling in the sense of the billions spent looking for simple pathologies which just aren't there and we've never found. Yes. So to summarize, are we storytelling? Sort of. The story is incredibly complex and we're never going to be able to tell it fully, and that's fine. We have to be humble about that, but also just try and do our best. And I think that these stories do matter, and the fact that it's a complex story that we're all now playing a part of, and that is the reason for our being, is in itself actually kind of a nice thing. The complexity is beautiful in its own way, and encouraging and empowering, maybe. Yes, thank you.